Well, it's 9:30, so I'm going to call this session to order. My name is Greg Tylka, and I'm a faculty member at Iowa State University. I've been there 28 years, 1 month, and 2 days, so keep track of it all. And I was hired to work on soybean cyst nematode specifically. And that right there should tell you a little bit about the importance of this pest to the soybean industry in the United States and Canada. Today I'd like to present some information that lays the groundwork for a new education effort that we are launching at Commodity Classic called the SCN Coalition. And then most importantly, rather than hearing all about SCN just from me, we have 2 farmers who have battled soybean cyst nematode, in my opinion, very successfully. And I think you have more to learn from them than from me. But as a typical academic, I have to show PowerPoint slides. It's in my contract, and so I'm going to do that. We did this SCN Coalition 20 years ago, and it was wildly successful, but it led us to where we are here today. So in the first SCN Coalition, we did some market research to find out that farmers were unaware that SCN might be in their soils, but if they simply tested in one of 2 ways and discovered the pest, that really put them on the path to beating the pest, because there were some very simple, very effective management strategies. As I said, that really worked very well, but it led us to where we are today. It maybe perhaps worked too well. Before I go any further, though, I want to focus in on the word coalition for the SCN Coalition. That means a partnership of various entities, and we have a wonderful set of partners to launch us, and we hope to add to the partner list as we move forward in the upcoming years. The primary financial supporters of the coalition to this point are the soybean checkoff organizations, the North Central Soybean Research Program, and the United Soybean Board. I don't see any representatives from those organizations in the audience, but if you see a board member, know a board member of either of those organizations, please thank them for this support. We also have wonderful corporate partners. I call these the charter partners only in that they're the first partners that are with us today at the launch, and the logos of those are shown here. I'd like to acknowledge a couple that I see. Our counterparts from Bayer, Melissa Cho and Jeremiah Mullick, are sitting over. Want to raise your hands? And I didn't know if I saw any other corporate partner representatives in the audience. If I did, you should raise your hand and get my attention. And then finally, we also have the universities involved right now throughout the North Central region, but eventually it will be nationally. And this is not just a U.S. effort. In fact, it's North American. And I saw Albert Tenuta from Ontario walk in earlier. Did he stay? Or Albert, are you? Oh, yeah, he's there in the back. So we've had a bunch of academics and great feedback from the industry and great financial support from the checkoff organizations. The final thing I'll mention about the partnerships is that we plan on partnering meaningfully with the state soybean associations as well. And so that's the type of thing we're going to work through as we move forward. So anyway, back to the first SCN Coalition. As I mentioned, very simply, take the test, beat the pest. The beat the pest part was grow resistant soybeans, and that worked wonderfully, but too wonderfully perhaps. So at Iowa State, I track the number of different SCN-resistant varieties that farmers could grow, and I've done that since 1991, and that's the bar graph you see there. And then the part of the bar graph that is in gray is one source of resistance genes called PI88788. And all the other sources of resistance I've lumped together in the red part of the bar. And I don't know about you, but I see that that's a visually striking potential problem, that we've used the same set of resistance genes for 25 years. I mentioned this is representative of Iowa, but it certainly is representative of farmers' choices throughout the Midwest and in Ontario and in the southern United States as well. PI-88788 is virtually almost the only source of resistance genes that has been used. And that's led to some problems. Just like if you would have used a single herbicide active ingredient for 20 years could result in problems, we've now documented problems with using that single source of resistance genes. And what's shown on the map up on the screen right now is the percent of fields that have SCN, but that SCN has built up reproduction on 88788 resistance. So the most glaring example might be Minnesota, where 95% of the fields that have SCN are no longer well controlled with that PI 88788 source of resistance. And as you can see, this is a region-wide or North American-wide problem. Now, I don't have survey to show data to show for Iowa, but I've been conducting field research in farmers' fields in Iowa for 25 years. And every time we do an experiment in a farmer's field, we collect a sample of the nematode and test it on pure PI 88788 back in the greenhouse. And so what I'm showing in this graph is the ability of farmers' SCN populations to reproduce on PI 88788 over the years. Now, in the 90s, which is not shown in this graph, we had very good control of SCN populations in Iowa's farmers' fields with PI 88788. But what you'll see, not in 2000, but starting in 2001, these dots are above, they're increasing, and they're above a 10% level, which is where we would want to be below. So each one of these dots represents an Iowa farmer field in which we did an experiment. And again, we pulled out the nematode from that farmer's field and we brought it back to the greenhouse and grew it on pure PI 88788. So in 2017, we conducted 9 field experiments, and in those fields, there were SCN populations that reproduced anywhere from 20 to 60%, when it should have been below 10%. So this kind of shows you a time course of the buildup of SCN on 88788 resistance in Iowa to get us to the point that was shown in the previous map as well. The other thing about the data I just showed you from Iowa fields is we grew cyst-resistant soybeans with PI 88788 in those fields. And so we had yield data. And this is a regression line of the yield of good PI 88788 resistant soybeans grown in those fields that have built up ability to feed on 88788 resistance. And I say that this line here showing the yield response doesn't look terribly ominous, but the yield on this part of the line, which represents high reproduction because the nematode is built up on 88788, is 14 bushels per acre less than back when the nematode was well controlled. So farmers growing really good, effective, resistant soybeans with PI 88788 are losing up to or even more than 14 bushels per acre. Not because of anything related to the plant's genetics, but because the nematode is becoming resistant to the resistance. So we needed to do something to bring this problem to the forefront. And with initial financial support from Syngenta, we conducted some market research. And interestingly, we did the surveys. They were the exact same surveys that we did 20 years ago when we launched the first SCN Coalition. So we asked almost the exact same questions 20 years later. And what we found is in this left bar, you'll see that 94% of the farmers, and these are farmers from 17 different states, 94% indicated that they knew little or nothing about how to scout and check for soybean cyst nematode. The middle bar, though, said that almost 60% of them were growing resistant soybeans. And remember, that did us well for 20-some years. But it doesn't do us well now because the nematodes built up on the PI 88788 resistance. And this subportion, this number here in the bar, of those farmers growing resistant soybeans, 68% didn't know what the source of resistance was, whether it was PI 88788 or Peking or others. And oftentimes that information isn't easy to obtain from the seed tag or the seed catalog. It really varies greatly by company to company. But the bottom line is, if we're going to manage what source of resistance farmers use, it has to be easily available information. And then something that didn't exist at the time of the first SCN Coalition, there are now nematode protectant seed treatments. And so we asked which farmers or how many farmers use those products, and 22% indicated that they did. So that's brought us to the 4 basic pillars or management recommendations from the SCN Coalition. And those are, first, to know your number or actively monitor your fields by taking soil samples to check for soybean cyst nematode, and then in those fields that are infested, use an integrated approach of resistant soybean varieties with multiple sources of resistance, grow non-host crops, and use nematode protectant seed treatments. And there's no longer a single approach to managing SCN. It requires all 3 of these, and it requires active monitoring. So that brings us to the gentleman to my left. We have with us today Pat Duncanson from Mapleton, Minnesota, and Ron Heck from Perry, Iowa. And I have a set of questions to foster discussion among these gentlemen, and I'm going to even go off script and entertain questions from the audience. And I think all I have to do is remember to repeat the question so we can capture it on audio and video. So I don't see anybody going like this for me not to do that. So we're going to go that way. All right. This is an easy start to the questions. And we'll start with Pat first and then go to Ron, but you all can, after this first question, probably chime in whenever you want. The first question would be, can each of you tell us a little bit about your farming operations? And Pat,
Sure.
Why don't you go first there?
Sure, thanks. I'm in south central Minnesota, about 35 or 40 miles north of the Iowa state line is where our headquarters are. And we are on fairly heavy soils, usually 4 to 6% organic matter, a lot of heavy clay-based soils. We have had a multi-generation farm, lots of family involved, and have had a lot of livestock involved in our operation as well, and have transitioned from cattle to hogs. So a lot of our fertility is coming from manure.
Very good. Ron?
So in my farm is soybeans and corn in rotation, family farm in central Iowa, also the heavy, flat, black soils. Crops only. We've been raising a corn-soybean rotation for a very long time, back into the 50s or 60s or somewhere in there. Soybeans are a big deal on our place.
Great. Greg, I'm just going to interject for as rotation goes. We have no standard rotation.
Okay.
Sometimes it's all corn. Sometimes it's seldom is it more than 50% soybeans. Soybeans are always in our crop plan, but we oftentimes grew a lot of corn for a few years.
So both of you are known to be early adopters of soil sampling for SCN. Could you tell us, kind of both of you, how you became introduced to SCN? And why don't we stick with Pat first, and then we'll go to Ron.
Sure. So I'm going to suggest that it was an accident of coincidence that I became aware of it. My wife was involved in soybean leadership, and so I came along to conventions and meetings. And as a supportive spouse, sat in on sessions like this, and I'm probably thinking that helped reinforce the idea of the need to do testing. We had some great agronomy partners, crop consultants, agronomists from co-ops and so forth, who said, you know, this is a good test to do. You should see if you have it. We really didn't see yield problems. We didn't see visual symptoms in the field, and we started testing and looking at numbers and just got educated real fast. And pretty quick, we had to take the pledge and say, I'm a farmer, I have cyst nematode. So.
And roughly what time frame was that?
I didn't have hair, so it wasn't that long ago. But I'm suggesting that that was probably in the mid-90s. The early years when we did that and started planting resistant varieties, we were actually taking a measurable yield hit by planting resistant varieties because the resistant varieties just didn't have the genetics that the racehorse varieties had. So we were pretty early on the front side.
Okay.
very early.
Okay, thank you. Ron, what's your introduction to SCN?
Well, and Greg knows my story well. I barely knew what a SCN was, if I knew at all. I don't actually know if I knew, but I was on the Iowa Soybean Association board, and in 1994, I got a yield monitor, and I got yield maps for my 1994 crop. And I'm sure you all remember the first time you got a look at your yield map and said, whoa, what's going on here? I took the yield maps over to Iowa State. I live 30 miles from Iowa State, and everyone I showed the yield maps to went, whoa, what's going on here? So in January of '94, we had a joint board meeting with the Iowa Promotion Board, the check-off research funding aside. I took my yield maps to the board meeting and showed them to the promotion board, and they said, whoa, what's going on here? And none of us knew. So the promotion board, and along with Iowa State, decided to do a precision farming research plot on my farm, taking two 50-acre plots, dividing those into half-acre grids, so we had 100 zones in each 50-acre field, and just test it for everything and try to find out what was creating this yield variability. We measured everything, soil fertility and pH and a thing called nematodes. The most significant finding to come out of studying that 100 acres was the SCN yield variability in the soybeans. It wasn't anything with corn, it wasn't soil fertility or pH, it was SCN. I thought I had iron chlorosis spots and that wouldn't grow beans very well. Turns out it was correlated to the high pH, but it was the SCN population that was causing the bad yields. We didn't know that. No one knew that. That's how the SCN Coalition was. The first one was born there. It's like, wow, this problem's out there, and we just don't know about it.
Great, thank you. And I didn't think far enough in advance to bring a copy, but in the first SCN Coalition, our charter media partner was Soybean Digest, and to help get the message out, there was a special 24-page insert in that magazine run in the summer of our first year, and Ron was poster boy for that special insert, and had a great editorial piece in there about his experience, and he's given many more presentations about soybean cyst nematode. And I say this often, and it's never in jest, that I think that Ron's probably educated more farmers about SCN than I have, because when you hear it from leading farmers like these two gentlemen, it really kind of brings it home. So of course I'm biased, but I think you should really pay attention to their stories and think about the situation as well. Okay, so we now know how you've kind of come to know soybean cyst nematode. Next question I'd like to ask, and again we'll just stick with Pat first, is what did you do differently once you discovered you had soybean cyst nematode in your fields?
Well, initially we said, well, the test must be wrong, and obviously if they're there, we don't like the result, we're going to question the test. But I mean, we quickly realized that that the test wasn't wrong, and we started studying more into the idea of testing and trying to understand what the test really meant. And right, wrong, or otherwise, I'm not an academic, and since we didn't tear the test apart, I took it as a yes or a no. I really didn't get all that concerned about an absolute number. Along with my brother Carl, we quickly assumed that if we had a few hundred or a few thousand and we didn't do anything, quickly those numbers would probably grow into many thousands or worse. We didn't have any numbers that were or worse starting off right away from the test. So we were on the front side of it, but we just took a management approach that for the long-term viability of our farm, we have to do something, and that something was planting resistant varieties as soon as we could get our hands on them, which was, it coincided with the time that we started. So that's the biggest thing that we did initially.
Great. Ron?
Yeah, for the 1995 growing season, getting your hands on an SCN-resistant variety was a challenge. There weren't many around, and they didn't yield as much in a non-cyst environment. But I was looking at some people call them prairie potholes, looking at those good low flat areas where this happened to me, where a raccoon couldn't hide from you in a bean field in August because the beans didn't give enough cover. And he and I were out there looking at each other. I thought, you know, I don't have a raccoon problem. I got a soybean problem here. So I didn't lose a lot of yield from planting the SCN-resistant varieties in those spots, because those spots went from 20 or 30 bushels an acre to over about 8 years. They started yielding 60 bushels an acre and now do 70 bushels an acre. But you got to start somewhere. If you got a bad spot, you think it's caused by something else, try the SCN-resistant beans. You don't have the yield penalty now that you had then, but still, even if you don't see it, the yield penalty has to be at least 5 bushels an acre, more likely 10 bushels an acre, before you can see it, and you lose that every year. So you have advantages now. There's good varieties that you can get. I didn't have that, and it was still worth doing. I wasn't losing yield from planting the SCN. I wasn't losing as much from planting the weaker SCN yielding varieties as I was losing from the nematodes that I couldn't see. That was a revelation to me. And furthermore, I couldn't get all SCN seed. It just flat out wasn't available. I couldn't do the whole farm to it. But early on in 95, 96, 97, if I planted SCN in a field in one cycle, 2 years later, that field would yield 3 to 5 bushels an acre more, because I'd put in the imaginary lower yielding variety 2 years previously.
And I call that the deferred payment on SCN resistance. You're going to get more bushels per acre that growing season, and you're going to get more bushels per acre 2 years later because of the nematode control. And that's a really insightful thing for you to grasp, especially 20 years ago.
Well, the deferred payment is forever. The SCN penalty, it might be not much, and then 2 years later it's 3 to 5, and then 3 cycles later maybe you're losing 5 to 10. Just get it early, and then get that 3 to 5 bushel bonus forever.
Yeah, great. Now I'm afraid I kind of know the answer to this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Soil testing. What are your thoughts on soil testing? I'll start with Pat first.
Sure. So we initially kind of went bonkers testing, and bonkers meaning we pretty much covered every farm on some bigger scale testing methods. And we used it as a yes-no test. Either we have them or we don't, and once we prove to ourselves that we had them. We have not done a very good job of following up to say, well, what are our numbers today? Admittedly. Sorry. But don't do as I do as I say.
Okay, and I'm afraid to ask Ron the same question.
Because Greg already knows that when I didn't even know what SCN was, I came back with tests of 20,000 in some of the grids, as high as 30,000 in individual samples. So I had to treat this. This is like finding one water hemp. You have to treat it, no matter what the count is. So I went to the rotations in the brochure there of PI 788 for 2 cycles, and then Peking resistance. And now I hardly ever soil test. When I get a new farm, I do. If I had a soybean field that wasn't yielding as well, I would take a test, but I don't have any of those fields. The last 5 or 6 tests I took were from too low to detect up to 200. So, no, I don't test because what I'm doing works.
And I will just point out that both of these gentlemen used to test, and they did know their numbers. And so you just can't, they're at a point in their management where testing might not be as critical as someone who doesn't know they have the problem or just starting the battle. And so I'm in our SCN Coalition, and me particular, I draw analogies to high blood pressure. And SCN is a lot like high blood pressure in a couple respects, and the first one is you do want to monitor your numbers, but I don't know if someone who has high blood pressure might not monitor it every day or every week or month or year, but these guys know that they have a feel for what's going on. But think about that high blood pressure analogy, and it relates to the next question I wanted to ask. I hopped on the internet and looked for the treatments for high blood pressure, and the response was there's medicine you should take, you need to lose weight, you need to exercise, you need to reduce salt intake, and you need to reduce or stop alcohol consumption. So there's no one thing you do to manage SCN. I mean, to manage high blood pressure. It's a Freudian slip. So it's the exact same analogy with SCN. There's no single bullet as there was back 20 years ago. And so I'd like to ask, again, Pat first, I have in front of you the 4 main pillars of management for SCN that the coalition is promoting, and you've touched on your soil testing or lack thereof, and can you give us some information about the other 3?
Sure, I didn't know this was actually going to be true confessions here. So can I go to the blood pressure questions instead? As far as rotating resistant varieties, we have tried to rotate away from the PI 88788 resistance, and particularly going with some Peking has been our primary genetic source other than PI 88788. And when we do that, we tend to have yield penalties. I shouldn't say tend to, we do every time. And it's really difficult to give up yield when what we had been doing with 88788 was working. So we have continued to plant a lot of 88788. We continue to plant a few Peking, maybe not every year, but every other year, and we rotate them around to different fields. And so we're doing a little bit of that, but admittedly not as much as we would like to. We are afraid of race shift. I'm afraid, do I know it's happening for sure? No. We are still getting excellent soybean yields. I absolutely don't want to wait until I'm not getting excellent yields if it's caused from a cyst reduction, because that means I've got populations that are in my opinion, way too high. I want to stay ahead of this pest. So other things that we are doing though is extending soybean rotations in the planting window. So during the period of the high corn price years, 2008 to 12, we planted a lot of corn on corn, which 1 year of corn on corn isn't necessarily going to help, but it sure doesn't hurt. So some farms we were 5 to 10 years of continuous corn, and which I do believe helps if we can stay away from soybeans. But I also let spreadsheets drive our planting decisions, and the last few years, 4 or so 5 years, it's been all about how many acres of soybeans can we plant. We aren't willing to plant beans on beans usually, but we have pretty much been planting a 50-50 corn rotation with soybeans. Prior to that, in the late 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, we also had the opportunity to plant peas, and we were able to get a processor contract. Peas by themselves were never a historically profitable crop in our rotation. However, there were side benefits to extending the soybean rotation, and other benefits with peas as far as summer drainage, a place to spread overflow manure, particularly when we had cattle feedlot running. And one of the unintended consequences of planting peas was the agronomy benefit that we got from it, whether it was directly related to cyst nematode, but there was definitely a yield bump by having that vegetable crop in the rotation. We didn't know it at the time, but we were following it with a cover crop. We didn't call it that, but so there was other things going on. And it's one of the things that we're continuing to look at as we are now planting what we call cover crops, to see if there is a benefit in something that's happening with the cover crops and nematodes. But and again, academically, I can't say, I don't want to infer that there is, because I just don't know. But as we look at the concepts of soil health and things that we're doing, the healthier our soils can be, the more resilient they can be. And the parallels just make sense to me. So it's something that we're looking at very seriously. So partly because we're doing such a lousy job at testing, and we're doing a lousy job at rotating genetics, one of the other things we're excited about is the chance that we can use seed treatments as a way to extend the present success that we're having. So we have been rotating some seed treatments on some various farms, and it's not an easy investment to make from a cost standpoint in an environment where we're trying to do everything we can to economize our programs. But as a way to allow us some peace of mind, it gives me peace of mind. So we're using some of the newer seed treatments, and I'm not able to stand up here and verify that these seed treatments are doing a wonderful thing for us, but they sure make me sleep better.
Well, and you've just redeemed yourself in my eyes by at least saying that you're using all of the things, even though you might be a little backward on the soil testing. So
thank you.
You can't be good at everything. So great. Ron, what's your thoughts on the 4 pillars of managing SCN? And I guess we know where you stand in soil testing as well.
Well, now, but originally it was the soil test that led me to know I had what my problem was, because I'd misidentified the problem. You don't remember anything else today. Remember that. If you misidentify your yield problem, if you have a place in your field where the beans aren't growing well enough to compete with the weeds, that's an excellent indicator of an underground nematode problem that you can't see. Just, if your beans aren't quite healthy or they don't quite yield, look for nematodes. Take the test on the soil. You can't beat that as a place to start. The second best place to start is to look at yield. If you just have a field that just doesn't yield much, even if it looks healthy and it doesn't quite yield there. So variety selection is extraordinarily important. And I don't know about all states, maybe Greg does, but Greg does a fantastic report of SCN resistant varieties where they, unlike most test plots, they go out and they look for fields that have a problem with SCN and use that as their test plot. They don't use perfect soil, these 80 bushel yields that you see that you can't have. Greg does it out more in the real world there and shows how different varieties perform. On some of these field tests, the Peking resistant variety is the top yielder. In many of the tests, the Peking beans are very near the top. Maybe you give up a half a bushel an acre because it's Peking instead of PI 788, when on the other hand, a half a bushel is less than the least significant difference for the yield on the test. So I'll say it often. You may give up more yield with a racehorse soybean variety than you would give up if you planted an SCN tolerant PI 78 variety, and they're not all the same. There's a lot of difference, and Iowa State tests will show you the difference. And even the Peking may be your best yielder. It was this year on my farm in one field. So the resistant variety is the most important action step on this list. My non-host crop is corn, and non-host crops are helpful, but you have to do them for a very long time to really manage the SCN. If you're committed to soybeans every other year like I am, it's all about varieties. And then I do use the seed treatments also, but I don't have strip trials where I can really say that they work great, they look good to me, I'm going to continue using them, but I don't have any data for you. Greg has the data on picking your variety. Pay attention to that, and I hope your states have those. Are they generally available?
Some of them, yeah.
If you can't find them, look at Iowa State's.
As more seed treatments become available, I hope that Greg and others in the academic world are giving us confidence that they're worth the money, worth the investment.
And they are in general because it's an integrated approach. It's not putting all your nematode eggs in one basket, excuse the pun, with a resistant soybean variety of one set of genetics. It's a four-pronged approach of managing it now. It used to be, it was very easy 20 years ago. Literally take a soil test, plant a resistant soybean and you were good to go. And that's unfortunately not the case anymore. There's several more questions on this list, but I don't like to follow the rules completely, so I'm going to throw away the rest of the questions. I think we've touched on most of them anyway, and I'm going to open up we have about 5 minutes left to see if the audience has any questions, not of me particular, of the farmers here, but I guess if nobody, if you can't think of anything, you could ask me, but it's a rare chance to talk to these individuals. So let's see, does anybody there's a hand up for question?
My name is Dwayne Barkham. I'm from north central Iowa. I just want to know what I can expect for the cost of the soil test, approximate.
So the cost of a soil sample processing for SCN, it used to be only the university labs would offer that testing, but many of the private soil test labs now offer that as well, so it's easier to get done. And the price, I would say, for the whole geography would range from $25 to $40 a sample, depending on which particular lab you use.
Thank you.
Yep. Well, we got one here, and then next.
Yeah, Greg or the panelists. Has resistance to the specific races changed since, say, back in the mid-90s?
Yeah, that's we don't use the word race anymore, but it's what it is the buildup on PI 88788. The fact that the nematode has built up on PI 88788 could be called a race shift. In the old days, it was called a different race. That nematode population with higher reproduction on 88788 was given a different race number. But we don't use the race numbers anymore, but that's exactly what's happened. Yep, it's a different race that has built up in the fields. Yes.
Got a question here. I know this is a focus on soybean cyst, but also question if you tested for other nematodes, and do you keep an eye out for those, maloinic iron, root knot, and so on?
You guys, do you test for anything else?
We've done some very minor scouting for corn nematodes, as I would describe them, with my limited knowledge of underground insect pests. But we have not discovered big problems with that.
And I haven't tested.
I have a mic. So with the shift, so with not calling them races anymore, but the companies are still reporting when a grower looks at their varieties, they see resistance to X races. How can they use that to make decisions still?
It's extremely confusing, which is why we shouldn't ever use races anymore. So the technical answer is there are 8 of the 16 races that can be controlled by PI 88788. But the seed companies in the old tradition of soybean breeding that originated in the South would report only on 2 or 3 of the races. And so it's an oversimplification of the situation, and that's why we need to shift to just talking about which source of resistance the soybeans have. And if the company doesn't provide that information in the catalog or the seed tag, it's a simple question to ask, and it should be a simple question to answer. But your question is the exact reason why the race system is no longer helpful, because there's 8 different races. I can't even keep track of the 8 numbers out of the 16 that are well controlled by 88788 resistance. So in many respects, it makes it overly complicated, not oversimplified. Just think about it in terms of the sources of resistance, the Peking versus 88788 resistance, and monitor how the nematode can reproduce on either one of those.
And are there only 2 sources?
There are 6 or 7. So her question was, are there only 2 sources of resistance? There are 6 or 7, but I'm not aware of anything available to farmers that has anything other than 88788 or Peking resistance. But technically, there are 6 or 7 different sources of resistance. The others are not being brought to market in varieties for farmers to grow. Good.
I have two questions. One is, Ron, when you did that testing, when they did that half-acre grids, was the cyst nematode you were talking about in certain areas was real concentrated? Was the concentration in places real high and maybe 2/3 of the farm was hardly any population at all? They were real hot spots, and other places there was virtually no egg masses? And the other question I was going to ask was, I haven't seen any university studies that track and test side by side with equal, where they mix soil together or something to check of the different products, which one has the best performance. It's kind of a hit and miss, and I've tried some of the products and they're not performing the same one year as another year, and one better than the other, I think. I'm looking for some guidance, university guidance on comparisons, and there just seems to be none out there.
Is that products like seed treatments or
yes.
products?
Yeah, seed treatments.
Yeah. I'm going to have to duck that one because I also have not seen anything that is useful. I know my bean fields look great with the seed treatment I use. Occasionally I can see a difference visually, but I don't have any real data for you other than it looks to me like the price of the seed treatments are very likely worth the money, but I don't know. It's a farmer answer. On the concentration of the nematodes question, that there is an answer to that. The nematodes seem to do better when the soybean plant is stressed from something. In my soil type, that stress is most likely pH. So the nematode population is much higher where the pH is higher. The percentages would depend how much of the field is low pH or high pH.
I would concur that my perception is that these nematodes, the nematodes are much more of an opportunistic pest. And if we manage our soybean fields well with other agronomic factors, we can really minimize some of those effects. To the seed treatment, I view that as an investment in the long-term productivity of our farm. And so we are starting to try to use the seed treatment as another tool just to help extend the effectiveness of the PI 88788, and I'm going to say we're kicking the genetic rotation can down the road by using another factor. Right, wrong, or otherwise, it's what we're doing.
When I go look at comparing the two early ones, Olivo at double the rate and Clariva, there is as many good for one as the other that there's no consecutive saying one is better than the other out there in the information I found. I was curious what products you might have used on your farms.
Yes, but conclusions are hard. There are so many variables. The seed treatments will give you a wonderful return if it prevents the soybean plant from being stressed to that point where the soybean plant says, "Oh, I'm done." You know, so if you got a healthy soybean and no disease, the seed treatments won't help. If you have a slightly diseased spot, the treatments will take care of it. And I think that's why there's no direct answer yet to your question, because it just depends on the stress.
I'm a victim of circumstance, and we are seed growers for a Syngenta seed plant, so that might give you an idea which one we are using on those acres.
Question behind. Can you pass the mic?
My question has to do with I guess the relationship between sudden death and soybean cyst nematode. And what have you seen, your experience on that? Because I think in our area, I'm from Nebraska, we didn't think we had sudden death for a long time. Then all of a sudden it shows up, and then we find out we have nematodes in those areas.
You guys?
So soybean stresses don't just add, they multiply. So you have one stress plus one stress, you've got a soybean that's 4 times stressed. You add another stress and it just keeps on multiplying. So SDS is the ultimate one where the bean actually dies. Anything you can do to take away a stress will help with your SDS. Because the soybeans will be a little sick, they'll have the flu. They'll get a cold, they'll have the flu, and then they just stop. So, yeah, that's why I use the seed treatments, because I want to take away as much stress as I can.
I would concur until we get to white mold. And then it's like, oops, I took away too many stresses, and the white mold gets us.
Yeah.
I just make a comment on these seed treatments from my perspective. There is a difference in the seed treatments. I think they both work, and my experience is like you guys say, maybe one's better one year, one's better the other. But the Chloriva actually kills the nematodes, and the other basically makes a halo around it. Doesn't really kill the nematodes. So if you're really looking for a long-term effect, which I am, and I'm a farmer, I like to kill things other than my crop. So there's a difference.
But I think what was really insightful was what the first gentleman said and what these two folks have chimed in on, and that is it's you got to kind of have the long view of things, and it's hit or miss sometimes, but overall it adds to the integrated management of soybean cyst nematode, and that's you got to take kind of the 30,000 mile view, not the 3 mile view, that you're going to be farming in those fields for quite a while, and you got to invest in the fields.
Any indication of resistance with the Peking showing up?
So I'll answer that one. So I showed the dots in the Iowa farm fields building up on 88788. I could show you a similar graph because we tested on pure Peking as well. And there are very few dots above the 10% level. So I can't say that we've never encountered an SCN population that did pretty well on Peking, but it's fairly unusual compared to it's the usual now with 88788 resistance.
The rules of biology that I learned in 4th grade say that if we were to overuse Peking resistance, we'd eventually have a problem there.
And so that is a message you'll hear from the SCN Coalition moving forward. Please don't grow all Peking either, because we'll simply be going down the same path. We can't abandon PI 88788. We've got to hang on to it. We've got to use good versions of PI 8788 varieties with Peking. But again, it sounds like a broken record. Seed treatments, non-host crops, we got to do the whole integrated approach. It's just not as simple anymore. We need to become more active.
A follow-up question, Dr. Tylka.
Yeah.
Could you give any clarification on the absolute nematocidal activity of the two seed treatments? There was a comment left that maybe the levo, the fluopyram, isn't a true nematicide. Could you clarify that?
Well, yeah, so Chloriva it was known from the start to contain a bacterial parasite, and so it's easy, and it only parasitizes soybean cyst nematode juvenile. So that bacterial parasite has been around, we've known about it since the 1980s or 1990s. It was first discovered in Illinois. And Alivo was a serendipitous discovery. Alivo is based on a fungicide to manage sudden death syndrome, but it was discovered to have nematicidal activity. And I have seen it kill nematodes as well. In 30-day greenhouse studies, it turned a susceptible soybean to the level of reproduction that you would find on a resistant soybean. So it knocked it down by 90%. And then we've done more intricate studies looking at exudates given off by the seeds and the roots grown from treated seeds with Alivo, and we see inhibition of movement of the nematodes and eventual death. And so it's a complicated situation, but we see truly biological effects, adverse effects on the nematode from Alivo, plants treated with Alivo as well. But it's a more complicated thing to think about than the parasite of Chloriva attaching and infecting and killing. So. Questions over here? By the way, I'll sit here till noon entertaining questions with everybody, so if there's a hard stop, I'm assuming somebody will tell us, but question, looked like there was questions here.
The proper time for soil sampling is in the fall, correct?
The proper time for soil sampling is any time you will do it.
Okay, so it can be done this spring?
Fall is a great time after harvest because it's easy to zigzag through harvested fields. If you're too busy to get it done in the fall, in the spring, it can be done in the north. You should wait till the ground thaws and drains a little bit. And you have a little less time to digest your numbers if you wait till the spring. You could even sample in the middle of summer. You'd have to zigzag your way through standing bean fields. So you can sample almost any time, but fall's the best time, spring's an okay time, and summer as well. Well, any last questions, or not questions, comments from Pat and Ron? Is there anything you were dying to say that we haven't touched on already?
I think you've given us an opportunity for that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, same here.
Well, so I'd like to conclude by thanking the audience for coming and attending, for your attention, and let's thank the two farmers, Pat and Ron, as well. Really appreciate the comments.